A swamp outside a city nobody in London could find on a map becomes, on one cold January morning, the graveyard of an empire's confidence. In under half an hour, a professional army that had chased Napoleon across Spain is broken by farmers, frontiersmen, free men of color, and pirates standing behind a wall of mud and cotton. By the time the smoke clears, close to 2,000 British soldiers are dead, wounded, or missing. The Americans lose barely more than 100. This is the story of how that happened, and why it almost didn't. To understand the mud outside New Orleans, you have to go back 2.5 years to a war that America started with confidence and had since forgotten how to win. The War of 1812 was supposed to be quick. American leaders talked about marching into Canada and being welcomed as liberators. Instead, invasion after invasion collapsed into humiliation, and by the summer of 1814, the war had become something closer to a stalemate nobody wanted to admit to. Then came August and the burning. British troops marched into the nation's capital almost unopposed and put the government buildings to the torch. The Capitol, the president's mansion, reduced to blackened shells while the president himself fled into the countryside. It was a wound to national pride that the young republic would carry for generations. But empires don't run on pride alone. They run on rivers and ports, and the British High Command understood something the burning of Washington never could achieve on its own: real, lasting leverage. Thousands of miles away, in the city of Ghent, diplomats from both nations were already negotiating an end to the war, arguing over maps and borders in warm rooms, while soldiers kept dying in the cold. Nobody knew if or when that treaty would actually be signed, and even less certain was what it would say. So Britain reached for one more card to play. Take New Orleans, take the mouth of the Mississippi. Every ounce of grain and cotton and pork raised in the American interior traveled down that river to reach the rest of the world, and whoever controlled its mouth controlled the artery. If the war ended with a treaty, holding that city meant Britain could dictate terms. If it didn't end at all, holding that city meant strangling the American West before it ever grew powerful enough to matter. Either way, New Orleans was the prize worth more than Washington had ever been. The man they sent to take it was not some cautious bureaucrat in uniform. Major General Edward Pakenham arrived with a reputation forged on the same battlefields that had broken Napoleon's marshals: Salamanca, Vittoria, the long, brutal grind of the Peninsular War. He was the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington himself, and he carried with him roughly 8,000 soldiers, hardened veterans who had never lost to anyone who wasn't French. To men like this, the idea that a scattered American militia could stop them was almost insulting. Waiting for them was a man just as certain of himself and just as dangerous. Andrew Jackson reached New Orleans in December of 1814, sick with dysentery, thin as a rail, and radiating a kind of restless fury that made even his own staff nervous to stand near him. He did not wait for permission from Washington to act. He declared martial law over the entire city, a move of questionable legality and undeniable effectiveness, and began building an army out of whatever the city could give him. That army should not have worked. On paper, it looked almost like a joke. Regular army soldiers mixed in with Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen who had grown up hunting deer through the woods since childhood. Free black militiamen fighting for a country that barely recognized them as citizens, Choctaw warriors, Creole aristocrats, and smugglers. Actual pirates. Jean Lafitte and his men knew every hidden channel and bayou around the Delta better than anyone alive, and more importantly, they controlled stockpiles of gunpowder and flint that Jackson desperately needed. In exchange for a pardon, Lafitte handed it all over. Jackson took it without hesitation. He needed every gun he could get. What Jackson understood, better than almost any general of his era, was ground. He chose to make his stand along a narrow canal a few miles below the city, a strip of land pinched between the Mississippi River on one side and thick, waterlogged cypress swamp on the other. There was no way around it. Any attacking force had to come straight through, funneled into a corridor with nowhere to turn and nowhere to hide. His men deepened that canal into a proper ditch and piled the dugout earth into a rampart behind it, reinforced with cotton bales dragged in from nearby plantations to soak up musket fire. Artillery batteries went in at intervals along the whole line, their fields of fire crossing and overlapping across the open field ahead. It wasn't just a defensive position. It was a machine, built for exactly one purpose. By the morning of January the 8th, that machine was loaded, primed, and waiting in the fog. The British plan, on paper, was sound. One column would strike the strongest section of the American line head-on. A second would advance along the riverbank, and a smaller detachment would cross the Mississippi in boats under cover of darkness to seize the American guns on the far bank, silencing the fire that could otherwise rake the main assault from the side. It was, in theory, a plan with real teeth. In practice, it started falling apart before a single shot was fired. The river current ran stronger than expected. A canal meant to launch. The boats had partially collapsed. There weren't enough vessels to carry the men across in time. The flanking attack that the entire assault depended on simply wasn't going to happen when it needed to. Pakenham knew this in the darkness before dawn. He had a choice in front of him that would decide everything: A, delay the attack until the flanking force was finally in position, or trust that 3,000 disciplined soldiers advancing together could carry the line through sheer weight and momentum before the American guns did too much damage. Jackson's scouts had already tracked British movements through the bayous for days, so surprise was gone regardless. Every rifle was loaded. Every cannon was aimed. And still, Pakenham gave the order to advance. As the first gray light crept over the horizon, the columns stepped off. Shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, drums keeping the pace, exactly the way they had marched to victory across Spain a dozen times before. For a few minutes, the morning fog swallowed them, ghost shapes moving silently through the mist toward a line they couldn't yet see. Then, the fog began to lift. What the leading ranks saw, as the mist thinned, was a long, low wall of mud and cotton stretching from the riverbank into the tree line, dark cannon mouths spaced along its length, and above the rampart, hundreds of silhouettes standing motionless, rifles resting on the muddy edge, waiting. Behind that wall, Jackson's men held their fire on his direct order. Let them come close. Don't waste a shot. For the Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen in particular, this kind of stillness was nothing new. A lifetime of hunting had taught them exactly how to wait. 300 yards, 250. 200. The field was enormous and silent except for boots sucking through the mud and the steady rattle of drums carrying across the open ground. Then, the entire line erupted at once. The artillery fired first, cannon loaded with grape shot tearing gaping holes straight through the packed formations. Whole sections of marching men simply vanished. Then the rifles opened up, and at that range, the frontier marksmen did not miss. Because the British were packed so tightly together, even a shot that missed its intended target still found the man standing beside him. The front ranks began to dissolve. Men tripping over comrades who had been alive seconds earlier, officers shouting orders that nobody could hear over the roar. And then came the failure that turned a bloody assault into a massacre. The soldiers carrying the bundles and ladders needed to cross the ditch and scale the wall had been separated from the main column somewhere in the smoke. When the survivors finally reached the edge of that canal, they found nothing to cross it with. No way forward. No way to climb. Just a wall they couldn't reach, under fire they couldn't escape. It was in this exact moment, watching his assault stall and disintegrate in front of him, that Pakenham made the decision that would end his life. He rode forward, waving his hat above his head, trying to be the spark that pushed his men over the top through sheer force of example, the same way he'd done it in Spain a dozen times before. His horse was shot out from under him. He mounted another, rode forward again, and a moment later was struck in the arm. He kept riding. Then a second shot found him, and this one was fatal. His aides carried him from the field to die beneath a tree, far from the line he'd been trying to reach. Watching their commanding general fall was the moment the assault broke, not just tactically, but psychologically. His second-in-command, General Gibbs, tried to rally what remained of the column and was struck down himself within minutes. In the space of just a few terrible moments, the British Army outside New Orleans had lost both of its senior commanders on the field, and what remained became an army with no one steering it. Some units kept advancing anyway, carried forward by training and momentum, with no one left to give the order. Others froze in place. Some began drifting backward, only to discover that retreating across open ground under continuous fire was almost as deadly as advancing into it. Behind the American rampart, riflemen worked in rotating ranks, one line firing while the next stepped up to reload. So there was never a gap, never a pause the British could use to regroup. The artillery, some of it manned by Lafitte's own privateers who'd spent years handling naval guns, fired canister shot at ranges under 200 yards, turning each blast into something closer to a massive shotgun tearing through packed formations. In places, entire companies that had stepped off at dawn with 60 or 80 men were reduced to a handful of shocked survivors within a quarter of an hour. One final act of defiance rose out of the chaos. The Highland Regiment surged forward with the wail of bagpipes cutting through the gunfire, advancing further than any other unit that morning had managed. It changed nothing. The same wall of fire that had broken every column before them tore into their ranks as well, and the pipes fell silent. By the time General Lambert, the last senior officer left standing, reached the front to assess what remained, there was nothing left to salvage. Bodies lay in long, uneven rows marking the high point of each failed advance, and small clusters of surviving soldiers crouched behind the dead, using their own fallen comrades as the only cover left on that field. Lambert gave the order that Pakenham never could bring himself to give: withdraw. But retreat under that kind of fire carried its own horror. Our men who stood to run were cut down in the open, and the only real safety was to lie flat among the fallen and wait for the guns to fall quiet. Eventually, they did. Not because the Americans had run out of targets, but because there was nothing left advancing toward them. When the smoke finally cleared, the men who climbed down from behind that rampart walked into a landscape that none of them, hunters and shopkeepers and river pirates alike, were prepared to see. From a distance, the sheer density of red coats scattered across the mud created the illusion of a field flooded in blood. Up close, it was worse. The illusion gave way to the reality underneath it. Pools collecting in the low ground, soaking into churned earth, staining the canal water dark. Roughly 2,000 British casualties in less time than it takes to sit through a church service. The Americans, dug in behind mud and cotton, lost only a fraction of that number. New Orleans held, and in a strange twist that history rarely allows, none of it needed to happen at all. Unknown to either army standing in that field, a peace treaty had already been signed in Ghent 2 weeks earlier, officially ending the war. News simply hadn't crossed the Atlantic in time. The battle that made Andrew Jackson a national hero and paved his road to the presidency was fought entirely after the war it belonged to had technically already ended. But strategically, none of that mattered nearly as much as the outcome on the ground. Had the British taken New Orleans, even a treaty already signed might have been renegotiated from an entirely different position, with Britain holding the mouth of the Mississippi as leverage no diplomat in Ghent could undo. Instead, the battle became something else entirely in American memory. Proof, real or imagined, that this scattered, argument-prone republic could stand against the most feared army on earth and win decisively. It launched Jackson into the presidency. It gave the young nation a founding myth to rival the revolution itself. And it did all of it in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee, on a strip of Louisiana mud that the men who fought there would never be able to forget.